The After Show with TelecomTV's Guy Daniels and Ray LeMaitre.
Yes, welcome to The After Show on Telecom TV. I'm Guy Daniels, Director of Content, and we are broadcasting live at the end of Day 3, the final day of the Telecom TV Summit on Open RAN. And once again, we've got a great lineup of guests joining us, and we're going to answer as many of your questions as we can. So if you haven't yet got in touch, then do so now, and please don't leave it too late. Co-hosting the After Show is, as always, Ray LeMaitre, Editorial Director here at Telecom TV. Hi, Ray. Earlier today, we lifted the lid on Telecom Silicon, which is a new area for many of us and which dovetails very nicely into Open RAN.
Absolutely, Guy, and it's not very easy to say, as we both know. And of course, hardly a day goes by now without some kind of discussion about the chip sector because of the current supply chain issues. But of course, it's absolutely critical that the best possible components are available for the very demanding workloads of disaggregated radio access networks. So there's plenty of work to be done here. Though there are many more companies now working on the required chipsets than there were a year ago, as Iago Tenorio pointed out earlier this week during his executive interview as part of this Open RAN Summit.
Yeah, it was a good interview there with Iago, and well worth watching if you haven't yet done so. He always has some very interesting things to say. Now, on with the show, and joining us live on the programme today are Paul Crane, Networks Research Director at BT, Scott Poretsky, Director of Security North America at Ericsson, Gilles Garcia, Senior Director, Business Lead, Wired and Wireless Group at Xilinx, Timon Sloan, VP Marketing and Ecosystem for the Open Networking Foundation, and Francis Haysom, Principal Analyst with Appledore Research. Hello everyone, very good to see you all again. Now, as always, lots of audience questions to get through in the next 45, 50 minutes or so. So Ray, over to you to start us off.
Okay, thanks very much, Guy. So Paul, going to give this first audience question coming to you today. And the question is, Rakuten Mobile has succeeded in 4G by innovating using open interfaces ahead of any standards or specifications. Does this point to a different future standards approach in Open RAN, more akin to the IETF model, or de facto standards creation through software evolution and success? So a long but very important question. Paul, any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, Rakuten have done a great job, and they've got a really great ambition as well for the solutions they're building. I think the approach they took was necessary because there weren't the standards available at the time. From an operator's point of view, what we're after is a rich set of rich ecosystem of components or solutions that we can purchase at the right time. And to date, the traditional methods of doing standards, if like the 3GPP approach, has actually served operators really well. I think that with Open RAN, along with any other telecom standards, the really, really important thing is that those standards are global. That there is one set of standards that the whole industry can coalesce around, so we get those economies of scale. We do get that rich ecosystem of supply, and my guess is, and what seems to be happening is that the Open RAN Alliance is is where the center of gravity is to be that rich set of standardized interfaces. The combination of adopting 3GP standards, adopting IETF protocols, and developing new interface standards where they're not done elsewhere. So I would expect over time that solutions like Rakuten's or others that come about will adopt Open RAN Alliance interfaces, and that will will enable that rich supply of components which can be built into various solutions.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Timon, we'll come to you first, and then we'll come up to Francis. So, Timon, what are your thoughts? Obviously, the ONF is clearly developing stuff here. How do you see things going forward?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. I think the world has moved to an era where it's not always led by standards, but that software implementations actually inform what's possible, demonstrate sort of an end state, or can sort of disprove the naysayers. And the IETF, that was kind of an interesting analogy or reference. Back in the day at IETF, it was there wasn't so much open source, but people were doing private implementations and then using that to sort of indicate what was possible. Now we can actually do implementations in open source, really demonstrate and make those available really broadly. What Rakuten has done is clearly moved the industry pretty dramatically, and also what ONF, this is central to ONF's model. If for those of you who recall, ONF started as a standards organization doing OpenFlow. That feels like eons ago now, but we've done a hard pivot towards open source over 5 years ago now. And really, this is near and dear to our heart and central to our mission and our approach. And I would just end by saying that, as another indicator that the actual founders and leaders of the ORAN Alliance, not just the companies and the operators, but the individuals are all directly involved with ONF and our SD-RAN efforts, because pairing an open source implementation with standards is really now the new norm and really the best proven way to move the industry forward as rapidly as possible.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Timon. Francis, what are you seeing out there in the market? Are you seeing a shift in the way things are developing in terms of specifications and blueprints and so on and so forth?
I guess I would kind of say I don't want to come across as sort of saying standards are relevant anymore, but I think the really key thing that's changed in networks is, and I've said this in a previous session, is it's all software, and the opportunity cost in software is much lower than the opportunity, the cost to develop something in hardware. So we in telco, we fundamentally have still kind of a hardware legacy process that we're thinking about here, where if something was going to work in 5 years' time when the standard works, and you'd gone away and developed hardware, you needed to make it work. The standard needed to be there for you to make that investment. Software that has a very different sort of upfront cost in terms of its development. That doesn't mean you don't want standards, but it does mean you can think differently about how standards are evolved, and also to some extent innovation in front of the standard. I don't think we're seeing, Rakuten is probably a very specific example where they're very actively saying we can't wait for the standard, and they're doing the same with the RIC as an area. But there's an opportunity more widely in the industry to this idea of ecosystems, trying things, open source developments of interfaces, I think is something that needs to be considered, and is an opportunity to really actually speed the development of things like Open RAN.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can see evidence of the major operators looking to move things on and influence things like the European operators and their Open RAN MOU. Definitely looking to accelerate developments there. Okay, if no more comments on that particular question, we'll go across to Guy for audience question number 2. Over to you, Guy.
Yep, thanks, Ray. And this next question, Francis, I'm going to come straight back to you to start with, because this is a question that's come off the back of the RIC panel that we ran earlier this week on the summit. The question is, when can we expect to see R apps and X apps running on various RICs in a truly plug and play manner?
I think we need to start. We're right at the beginning of the implementation of the RIC. It's a very exciting development, but we are very, very early stage. I think certainly our view as Appledore is that Open RAN is coming, come what may. But really, what drives really plug-and-playable X apps and R apps at scale is going to be the adoption of the underlying the horizontal disaggregation of the RAN that allows that vertical disaggregation to happen. That is very, very early stage. 5G networks that are being deployed at the moment aren't being deployed necessarily with that full openness at the moment, and that's really going to be the biggest thing that impedes it. From our point of view, we've done some assessment. We think roughly these type of technology substitutions take roughly about a 15-year replacement cycle, and so I think generally you should be looking for this thing to be starting to see interesting ideas probably in the next year, but large scale adoption is probably going to be some way through that adoption cycle, somewhere between, I would guess, about 30%, 50%, which is going to be about three to 5 years in terms of wide scale adoption. I think also you've got to consider there's two very different drivers in terms of the X apps and the R apps. I think you're going to see quite a lot of innovation in the XApp area because it's the thing that will immediately drive a different behavior in the RAN or different optimizations of the RAN. I think at the R app layer, you're going to see a slightly slower implementation there, particularly I think driven by what I would term is SOM plus type applications. So you've got a lot of vendors who want to be able to optimize and use AI more effectively to optimize across the whole of the network. That will need more deployment of the horizontal disaggregation, but it will also need, I think, that sort of first impetus within the XApp area to really drive that kind of longer term. So honestly, I think we're looking somewhere between 3 and 6 years for that type of environment.
Oh, that's interesting. Thanks, Francis. Scott, thoughts from you about when we can expect to see R apps and X apps running on RICs in a plug and play fashion? Scott, I think you're muted. Hey, just going to unmute Scott and try again. There you go, Scott.
All right, good. So I actually agree with Francis on that time frame of 3 to 6 years. As we're thinking about your question, as far as the deployment time that we'll start seeing R apps and X apps, it's important we, in our rush to deploy the functionality, also consider the security. And that's because there are many security considerations we need to have when it comes from X apps and R apps. Those are coming from third parties, integrating into our systems and making a lot of very important decisions down in the G node B. With those security considerations, we need to think about the third parties. Are those functions coming from third party trusted software vendors? Is it trusted software that's digitally signed? Does the functionality in those apps, the R apps and the X apps, conflict with each other? Do they conflict with decisions being made locally down in the G node B? Is the data that's in those apps protected so that PII and other business sensitive information is not lost through breach or any malicious person just inspecting that data?
Thank you, Scott. And issues of trust there, maybe restricting the timeframes and when we'll see truly plug and play manner for R apps and X apps. Paul, you'd like to add some comments to this viewer question?
Yeah, I think the RIC and particularly X apps is probably the most, the most exciting part of Open RAN. I think it's the area that's going to allow operators to differentiate its services and to truly optimize their networks in unique ways. I think split that question into two. When can you see X and R apps, and when can you see them plug and play? I I agree with the timescales that are being talked to before. I think along with those security issues that were just highlighted, you're playing with the core of your radio access network, and so integration, testing, ensuring that there isn't unexpected interactions between XApps that you're running is going to be really important. So I'm not sure, plug and play in the purest sense is ever going to happen without that really rigorous test and validation process.
All right, thanks, Paul. Great insights there, everybody. Thanks for those. In that case, I think we will swiftly move on then, Ray, to our next question.
Okay, thanks, Guy. Right, our next viewer question is going to come to you, Gilles. The panel this morning, so this is a very recent question, the panel this morning stated that RAN needs specialized and dedicated silicon. How is this statement compatible with the Open RAN presumption that radio access network, the CU and DU, can run on COTS, and more RAN can be virtualized on COTS and cloudified in public and private cloud? So, Gilles, how are things developing here in terms of what is needed in terms of silicon for Open RAN?
So great questions, and thank you, because I think that will help probably to put that back at the beginning of the Open RAN. Open RAN, you have all the 5G core, but this is really at the CU, DU level and the radio level. So on the radio level, there is no COTS server. So everything is around beamforming or radio DFE. So this is where a lot of the specialized silicon can be used for advanced beamforming or for advanced DFE radio functions. When you are now moving to the CU-DU, of course, COTS are the way to go. But you also need to consider what are the use cases that you are addressing. COTS servers and software, pure virtualized software, will be able to cope with 4x4 radios, potentially with 8x8 radios. But as soon as you are going beyond that or talking about massive MIMO, you will need to have accelerators that will be specialized silicon to process the right information and the level of information that a COTS server will not be able to process with the software. Same thing on the CU side, when you will have those large, complex use cases, security, and we discuss about that, but security will also need to be accelerated by the dedicated specialized silicon. That can be accelerator cards, that can be different type of components. But of course, as Xilinx One, we are playing on all of those. So I think it's important to differentiate the radio side, so all the radio units, where for advanced beamforming, very efficient DFE, you need specialized but flexible dedicated silicon, and the DU-CU, where in fact you need to complement the COTS servers to allow him to cope with the complex use cases and the amount of data that you need to process when we're talking about massive MIMO, 32T, 32R, or 6040, 64R type of radios with 16 downlink layers, 8 uplink layers. So that in very complex and huge amount of information to handle that need to be offloaded or accelerated with dedicated silicon.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of reminds me of the early days of virtualization, where it was, it's not just a case of getting any old server to run a network. That's just not how it works. So if we don't have any other responses to that question, I think we can move on, because Guy, I know you've been telling me in the background we're getting more great questions in, so the more we can get in, the better. So back over to you, Guy, for the next question.
Yep, thanks, Ray. We are indeed getting questions in as we speak, and we'll try and get onto those at the end of the show. Scott, next question from our audience then. Will the openness of Open RAN make it less or more secure than conventional RAN? Because, says the questioner, I've heard the argument for both cases. So, Scott, what do we say? Is it making it more or less secure?
It's a really interesting question and one that the industry is pondering globally. The answer to the question is yes. So it can be less secure. It may be more secure. What's really important here is standards and implementation. 3GPP has standardized 5G to be the most secure yet. ORAN is built on top of those 3GPP standards. And in building those standards, what they've done is disaggregated functionality and also added new functionality. The benefits of those, there are many security benefits that come from that disaggregation and additional functions. But at the same time, that also expands the attack surface. So there's security benefits, and then there's also security disadvantages. Now, this expanded attack surface has been acknowledged. It's been acknowledged by the ORAN Alliance. It's currently being worked by the Security Focus Group within the ORAN Alliance. It's even been acknowledged by members of the ORPC who addressed ORAN's expanded attack surface at their July security event. Now, fortunately, as I pointed to, standards are very important here. The ORAN Alliance is very actively now addressing the security of ORAN so that we can ensure it meets the security expectations that network operators and users on those networks have based on the networks they have today.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Scott. As you say, make sure you get the implementation right. And as you say, the ORAN Alliance is doing a lot of great work here. Francis, over to you for some more insights.
Yeah, I'd agree with Scott. It's definitely, yes, it has the opportunity to improve security. It generally in security, the more you can see of what is going on and the more people can look at that, the more opportunity you actually have to identify issues and have more people solving those issues. Much of security problems actually generally come down to misconfiguration and people quite often. So there is a slight challenge with Open RAN is that we're used to kind of a shell around the RAN, which is kind of proprietary, which is kind of hides it from the outside world in some degree, and we've been able to develop things behind that. That does go away to a large degree with Open RAN, and a lot more interfaces. And that's a lot more interfaces that can be wrongly configured. So I think a lot of the challenges, but the opportunities in security is about the automation of the security of those interfaces, the security and the automation of the configuration of those surfaces. The more we can remove manual intervention, the more we can keep the solution safe. But security shouldn't be an excuse not to adopt Open RAN.
Great, thank you, Francis. And Timon.
Comment that in many ways I like that visual of the shell around the RAN, and when sort of everything inside the shell is proprietary. The attack surfaces, there's the same square footage, if you would. It's just that they were hidden in the past and now they're being opened, and by opening them you're shining light on them. But the RAN is equally complex inside with proprietary implementations, and so I would argue that by opening it, by standardizing the interfaces, by getting more eyes on it, that ultimately we are making things much more secure over time.
Thank you very much for that, Timon. Thank you, everyone. In that case, Ray, let's get over to you for our next question.
Okay, thanks, Guy. Timon, this question is coming to you, and I think this is a result of somebody having watched the chat that we had that ran in the summit this morning. And the question is, why do we need SD-RAN when we already have Open RAN?
So, excellent question. I think that there are a couple of different terms. First, it's really important to level set. So Open RAN is almost the umbrella term about kind of opening the RAN, creating open interfaces. O-RAN and the O-RAN Alliance, and I suspect that's what the question is really referring to, are the set of standards and architecture for opening up the RAN. And then SD-RAN is ONF's project that's building open source implementations that are compatible with the O-RAN architecture. And these all are synergistic. They really all feed on each other. And ultimately, SD-RAN is implementing, combining components that are both open source and proprietary, and building solutions that can be taken to trial. And case in point, Deutsche Telekom just announced in the last 2 weeks or so that they have a live SD-RAN trial in Berlin that's combining components from over 8 vendors using all of the O-RAN interfaces, both the horizontal disaggregation that people have been talking about today, the RU-DU-CU, and the vertical disaggregation using the SD-RAN RIC and a set of interoperable XApps. So it's all necessary. What we're finding is that the SD-RAN effort is really helping demonstrate to the industry what's possible and helping to move everything forward much more expeditiously.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for the clarification there. Yeah, all moving everything forward in the same direction. And because that question was very specific to SD-RAN, I don't think we're going to get any more takers on that. And we have got more questions coming in. So, Guy, I'm going to hand back over to you.
Yep, thank you, Ray, because it's time to take a final look at our audience poll for this year's Open RAN Summit. 1 question, 5 multiple choice answers, and thanks to everyone who have voted so far, because as we said yesterday, we've had a record number of votes this week, and the votes just keep going up and up. And the question we have been asking is, which of these is the most important area of focus for the Open RAN community during the next 12 months? And here's the latest answers, our real-time data, up to the second data here. Oh, dearie me. Security is still propping up the table there in 5th place, although it's closing the gap with the first option there, the RRH pricing and functionality. But total cost of ownership is starting to take a clear and commanding lead as the most important area of focus for the community during the next 12 months. Well, do you agree or disagree? You've got until the end of this week to vote, and then we'll close the poll. So get your skates on. Back to our Q&A though, and we are about 30 minutes into the program now, so we still have time to answer a few more of your questions. Ray, have we got our next viewer question lined up?
Yes, Guy, we do. A really interesting, that if I can just comment on the poll there, really interesting the way that is shaped during the course of the week, but that total cost of ownership has always been out in front and had the most votes. It just goes to show that economic considerations are at the forefront of many people's minds. So very interesting results there. Our next question, audience question, and this is for the whole panel here today. The question is, will Open RAN development be held up by the current global supply chain issues around silicon? So will the current chip shortage hold back Open RAN developments? Does anybody want to come in and start the conversation on this one? Yeah, Gilles, thank you very much for stepping in. Let's come to you first.
Yeah, so thank you, Ray. So again, Xilinx, we are a silicon supplier, so I think it was obvious for me to jump in as the first one on this one. So I don't think so. I don't think that the current supply constraint that the overall industry is facing will slow down the Open RAN. There is, back to the previous question you asked, on the Open RAN, you have, of course, the radio that need to have specific components. Most of the COTS servers are also using different components, but I'm not expecting that the volumes expected by the Open RAN deployment over the next 2 years will be slowed down by the supply constraint. And this is even an opportunity for vendors to innovate with technology that are massively available and being able to show how Open RAN can be very efficient with what is available today, instead of potentially using leading edge technology that will not be available or will be constrained due to the overall geopolitical situation.
Okay, thanks, Sheil. And Francis, did I think you wanted to come in there as well?
Yeah, I'll come back to a previous comment I've made before. The key thing about Open RAN is going to be development of software. We're still at an early stage with Open RAN in terms of open deployment, so it's not like the whole of the global network is going to be replaced by Open RAN immediately. And one would hope the silicon's shortage is sorted sometime in the next year or two. So I think the thing that's going to drive the engine of Open RAN is software, and Gil's kind of sort of said it. One of the big areas is looking at how you use the commodity hardware that you have today. You better horizontally scale processes rather than always vertically scale with new silicon. A lot of the opportunities are there. So yeah, I don't. There's going to be issues in terms of deploying new networks with Open RAN, but I think in terms of the onward development and improvement of Open RAN, it probably doesn't matter that much.
Okay, great. Thanks, Francis. Okay, Guy, I think that we can now move on to the next audience question.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ray. And a question just in here. Will Open RAN end up being used only in rural areas and private wireless networks? So slightly contentious question there, but do we feel that there's no place for Open RAN in the urban areas? Anybody would like to take a stab at addressing that one? Paul, thanks very much.
Yeah, I think I think for most operators, you're likely to see Open RAN deployments, certainly in the next few years, deployed, in those specialist use cases. So, private networks, maybe small cells deployments, maybe neutral host. And the reason for that is that operators are very, very conscious of the customer experience that they're delivering. Most operators compete on network quality effectively, route metrics, and therefore you need to be absolutely confident that the solutions that you're putting into those areas where your main customer base is, those dense rural areas, is that quality of experience is maintained. So, but absolutely no, I don't see Open RAN as just being that rural use case or the private networks. I do see eventually that it will be the default way that we build networks. Open RAN is an example. I think network virtualization was referenced before. I mean, it's an example of the way that the whole industry is changing into a virtualized, disaggregated infrastructure. Open RAN is leader at the moment, but it's happening throughout the telecoms infrastructure.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. Well, let me first of all go down to Scott because we also come to Francis and Jill. Scott, you're on mute again. Let's tell you what. Let's jump up to Francis, and Scott will turn Scott off mute. Francis.
Yeah, keep it brief. I think the obvious answer is we already know that it can be deployed in dense urban areas. That's what Rakuten is doing in Japan. It has a completely Open RAN network nationally. It works in the center of Tokyo. I think, and the same would apply to its deployment probably at 1&1 in Germany. I think the big challenge actually, and the reason for the focus on rural and sort of private network areas is simply one of coexistence with a legacy or the brownfield. So obviously Rakuten is not having to work with a brownfield in its deployments. So I think a lot of it is not simply the Open RAN technology. It's much more an operational and a coexistence strategy with legacy networks.
Thanks for that, Francis. Back to you, Scott.
Yeah, sure. So there are aspects of Open RAN that we will definitely see in global deployments beyond just rural and private network. Now we'll start to see the initial deployments of Open RAN in those areas, rural and private networks. But the aspects of virtualization and cloudification and seeing cloud native applications being deployed, even with HCPs, hyperscaler cloud providers, those aspects of Open RAN will be deployed in larger networks. Now, whether or not we see things like the lower layer split across all of the ORAN architecture, will those be deployed? That's unclear yet, but certainly there are a lot of advantages coming from Open RAN where there will be pieces that we see in the larger networks.
Thank you very much, Scott. And Gilles, I think you wanted to comment on this question as well.
Yeah, I will try to be short. And the key point is there is no limitation in Open RAN that will prevent a deployment in downtown, the big cities with massive MIMO or with all the traditional, I would say, wireless networks. So I think that it's need to be clear that Open RAN can work very well in rural, in private, but as well in all the other aspects, downtown and all the in stadium and all the things that are expected to be by a robust standard. And I think it's very important to clear this point that there is no limitation in Open RAN for that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Gilles. I think in that case, we can try and squeeze in at least one more question from our audience. So Ray, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Guy. So this question is hot off the press. And the question is, can the panel give some examples of typical apps that will be run on RAN intelligent controllers, the RICs? So what kind of, maybe we can ask that in a different way. Maybe what will be some of the first examples of typical apps? Does anybody want to come in? Yeah, Timon, we'll start with you and then we'll come up to Francis. So Timon first.
Sure. So I can speak to what DT is deploying in the trial and where we see sort of initial implementations. Some of the simpler things are just sort of visibility, KPM or key performance monitoring. So you're just kind of getting a view into what's going on in the RAN. That's kind of a very easy step. There are some things around SON-like applications for reconfiguring unique IDs across the RAN. So as you deploy more cells, that you ensure any adjacent cells don't have any conflicts. That's deployed. Some mobility management and actually looking at load on different cells and influencing weights and moving UEs between different cells. That's coming, and then sort of into the space of both spectrum management. There's a lot of interest there in various forms, and also power management and trying to build greener networks and being able to optimize power consumption. So those are the hotspots that we see. I know it starts with the simpler and then sort of moves towards the more complex, which is what you'd imagine.
Okay, great. Thanks. Excellent examples there, Timon. Thank you. Yes, let's come up to Francis now. Thank you.
Okay. I think there's one very interesting example that's already being demonstrated by VMware and Cohere, where they're actually deploying a what is effectively, I believe it's termed reverse Doppler technology to improve effectively coverage and targeting of particular handset, so improving effectively capacity on a cell. I think that's anything that is increasing the potential of capacity of the cell is going to be very interesting, is going to be taken forward. That's obviously the trials phase at the moment, but I can't believe that that's not going to be taken forward in some seriousness. I do also agree with the previous comment, which is I think the other key area is going to be power management. We obviously have COP26 coming up at the moment, and the ability to be much more dynamic, much more tied with this horizontal disaggregation of the RAN. We've got a huge opportunity to potentially at low times bring things more to the center, at peak times to take processing more to the edge in order to make capacity. So there's going to be a whole number of areas in terms of the way the RAN is deployed and moved around that I would see as early applications, XApps.
Okay, great. Thanks, Francis. Scott, we'll come to you next. What do you expect to see first?
Yeah, so our apps will also see security applications. When you think about it, right now, security applications are very much using AI and ML, and then our apps, the R apps will also be using AI and ML. Those two will actually come together so that we'll have the R apps and X apps that are able to provide security functionality, particularly around threat detection, that's earlier and more precise. So that allows us to better respond to security events as well. I actually see these apps becoming very important in security in RAN and the rest of the network.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And Paul?
I agree with everything that's been said, particularly the R apps and security. I tend to divide up into two areas. One is optimizing the network, and the second is potentially new services that you can deliver. And so an example of a new service might be very, very accurate positioning because you can actually access the data from the RAN. On the optimization side, the way operators configure the networks, there are I don't know, a couple of thousand parameters which you can set on the RAN. You tend to configure them once and then just leave them. We've now got the opportunity for actually to be able to change those almost in real time. And so there will be a whole gambit of optimization type applications that will be developed because we've actually got access to that data and can actually change the network. And spectral efficiency is going to become increasingly important. There's more and more demands on the network, and we need to focus on that total cost of ownership as on the questionnaire you highlighted before.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Paul. Okay, well, I think that covers all the answers we have for that question. And Guy, I think that's bringing us towards the end of the show. Is that correct?
It is indeed, Ray. 45 minutes in. That's a great question for us to end on. Some terrific answers there. That is all the time we have. It's the end of our after show for today. Thank you all for joining us for this live program, and to our audience. All the questions you heard were from our audience. And that brings this year's Open RAN Summit to a close. But of course, it will return next year, and such is the pace of innovation in Open RAN that we are bringing forward the date to June 2022. So mark your calendars now. But we have more summits for you before then.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming up very soon, we have our AI and Automation Summit. That's in mid-November. And then in December, we have the Green Network and the Great Telco Debate, which is shaping up to be a real doozy.
Oh yes, can't wait for those. And watch out for news and updates about the AI and Automation Summit, because that starts on Wednesday, the 17th of November, the day after our special live strategy outlook program with Ericsson, as we continue our Open RAN coverage. Intriguing. And with that teaser, we shall say goodbye for now.
The after show was recorded in front of a live online audience.